Welcome to the Next in Queue podcast, a not-so-safe space for all kinds of news, views, and dialogue. Brought to you by Quilliam International.
Welcome to Next in Queue. We're here with Macer Gifford, and in the first part we talked about Macer's journey to fight alongside the Kurds to defend them from ISIS. We're now in the second part going to be talking about what it was actually like to be out there fighting on the front line against a terrifying terrorist force that was threatening the lives of millions of people. So you found yourself in Syria. You'd had a week's formal training, mostly in language. You'd received a little bit of informal training where you were taught to recognise IEDs and how to clear buildings. How long was it before you first saw combat?
Well, it was probably a month and a half, and it was the Tel Hamas operation. They had tried taking Tel Hamas back. This is the YPG, the year before. Dozens of people had died. It had been turned into a chaotic retreat, where the YPG lost not only dozens of people, but actually possibly as many as 100, 200 people, and tanks too, because ISIS simply counterattacked, and with no air support, and because ISIS had more fighters and were better equipped, they just were overrun. So there was an expectation of a huge battle to come. So when I finally went on this operation, it was like a sigh of relief that finally we were doing what we always said we were going to do, that we had wanted to do, had driven us to Syria.
I mean, how serious was it to have no air support at all?
It was pretty frightening. Although, thankfully, the YPG coordinated with the Peshmerga. The YPG sent hundreds of fighters, including myself, into northern Iraq towards sort of Sinjar mountain. And we almost went, a bit like the sort of Second World War, we went around the Maginot Line, because the ISIS had expected us to attack from the YPG areas. So when we went round them and went up from Iraq, they started to run, and they didn't stop running. And we had a tactic where we'd leapfrog each unit. A unit would attack the village, we would attack the next unit, another unit, and so we were constantly pounding away at their lines. But sadly, that was when foreigners started to die for the first time. Ashley Johnson, an Australian volunteer, was in an armoured personnel carrier outside a little village when his vehicle suddenly broke down, and the guys inside were like, "We've got to move, we're sitting ducks, we could get hit by an anti-tank missile at any point." The back door flew open, and there was a huge amount of open ground behind them, so the only way they could survive and actually get reinforcement and everything else was actually to go forward and actually start hitting and fighting back against ISIS. So as these guys were going forward, clearing buildings, coming under a huge amount of enemy fire, he popped out of a building twice and fired an RPG. And on his second, just after he fired it, he was shot twice in the chest and neck.
And I think you've said elsewhere that the thing you really fear in a combat situation like that is a sniper. It's being not being fought by the person you're directly in front of, but by somebody who's up there in a building who's got a sniper rifle trained on you. Yeah, well, it weighs heavily on your mind at all points, including in urban environments, whereby every step you take could be an IED. Every time you pass a window, every pass a blown open door, is there someone carefully keeping an eye out on this position? So it does weigh heavily on your head, and that's actually, it's not when they start shooting, it's almost a bit of a relief, because you can seek cover, you can fire back, you can move forward. Being caught out in the open is by far the worst, and you can almost be, although you're not paralyzed with fear, your heart is in a vice, and your head is pounding. And I can still remember on numerous occasions panting so loudly that I can still feel, even today, my chest coming up against my body armor and feeling constrained by it, feeling like I was in a vice. But therein was the battle. We went there to fight ISIS. We got caught. We were, most of the time, as I said, would spend months doing nothing. But then there was just periods of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes days, sometimes just a few hours, when it would just descend into utter violence. So after Tel Hamas, we were actually relieved that we actually got a week's break afterwards, and we could actually start focusing on the next objective. I think almost anybody you ever speak to who's been involved in combat describes it as long periods of intense boredom followed by short periods of intense terror. Was that true of this campaign as well?
Well, absolutely. And actually it was made worse. So in the early days, about 80% of those who went to fight ISIS were former military guys. That would actually change over time as the YPG started to realize that their desire for like an international style volunteer network and a sort of real revolutionary type atmosphere within the internationals was slightly out of sync with these guys who were mostly sort of conservative Christians, guys who just wanted to fight ISIS. So they started really recruiting a lot more sort of internationalists from Europe.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I mean, I know you said previously that you saw during your time fighting in Syria a shift from those sort of ex-military people to younger people, many of them German. Yes.
So, well, actually, in the early days, I've often said that we were predominantly Anglosphere, so a lot of Australians, a lot of Americans, Brits, Canadians, but then that would start changing over time to more Germans, more Eastern Europeans, more French, and even, and of course English and Americans were still heavily represented, but it was much more of a, people would openly say, oh, I'm an anarchist or I'm a communist, I'm here to fight ISIS, sure, but also to contribute to a sort of a real socialist revolution here, which was fine. And I mean,
this is a stark contrast with the man who ran as a conservative candidate.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm not, I've never been a communist or anarchist or anything like that. But one thing I do appreciate, and one thing that they didn't appreciate, and what they need to understand, any internationalist, any communist and anarchist who goes to Rojava, is that's not their ideology. Their ideology is democratic confederalism, which is all about individual responsibility. It's all about devolving power away from the state and giving it to communities, which is actually something that I can see working in Syria, which is so unbelievably diverse, with Christians, Arabs, Kurds and Yazidis all living side by side, that in the past, where predominant communities which are dominated by a particular ethnic or religious group can dominate the smaller ones, with democratic confederalism, actually, the Christian community can have their own voice. They can choose their own laws. They can choose how their children are educated. Whereas just down the road, the much larger Muslim community can have the life that they want. So it was actually a lot more fair and balanced. And it was something worth fighting for when I really got into it, when I started to learn about what the Kurds were after.
That's fascinating. I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about that. I mean, in some ways, that is reminiscent of the Ottoman sort of pillarized system, and you see it reproduced in Israel, for example, where individual communities, religious communities, have in family matters.
The kibbutz,
I'm talking about the way that Israeli law works. For example, that the Jewish authorities are responsible for Jewish marriage law, and the Muslim responsibility for Muslim families and their family affairs. There's the Ottoman Empire, I think, was the system from which that was drawn, where effectively communities did have control of their own sort of domestic law, the international relations, and the sort of broader state functions were a matter for the state itself. But you did have this sort of devolution of power to communities. I would be interested to hear your answer, but I expect you wouldn't think that was a great model for Britain.
Well, not in the sense that, because Britain's a very different country. And one thing I do appreciate about Britain is the sense of devolution, giving power to communities. Particularly, we've seen it recently, or in the past decade or so, with Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. So devolution is fine, taking power away from the state, giving it to communities, getting people involved. David Cameron tried to do it to some degree, talking about the big society, things like this, and less of having less state, quite essentially. It's all very well and good. I'm passionate about Britain. There's a lot that I would love to see changed. But I suppose I got bored of Britain, bored with the mundanity of its politics, and love and appreciate the excitement of the Middle East and what was going on in Syria particularly. So, for instance, the democratic confederalism has a huge amount of potential, because for the first time, it's an indigenous democracy movement that's making waves, that actually is very pro-West, very pro-rights and everything else. It's not like America or Britain or anyone else is implanting their concept of democracy on the Middle East. Far from it, which in Western style democracy tends to mean tyranny of the majority, if you all vote fairly.
Whereas the model here is essentially what we might describe as ultimate subsidiarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's based, it's got its anarchist roots of less state and communalism and all the rest of it. But still, it's just about inverting that pyramid of power and just, taking power away from the state, giving it to communities and unleashing Syria's potential. And quite interestingly, they have feminism, these sort of concepts at the very heart of their states. They don't have, each position of authority in Rojava and in Syria, has a male and female equivalents, and it's almost like they are deliberately going in a society in the Middle East which is so patriarchal, which is so conservative. They've gone completely the opposite way. So it's a revolution in every sense.
That's very much part of Kurdish culture. It is one of the things that one notes about Kurdish society is that it is a society in the Levant which has the sort of greatest degree of autonomy for women and women in leadership positions to a greater extent than many other countries in the region.
And inspired by actually the PKK. The PKK did a lot to, because one of the things that they've always said is they want to shatter the old tribal system of how the Kurds have operated in the past and the patriarchal society, which obviously still exists even in Kurdistan and amongst Kurds. And the PKK story was formed in the 1970s. Yeah. So
I don't want to be completely uncritical. I know Oliver Cam of the Times describes the PKK, certainly in the form it was in the 90s, as effectively a bit like Pol Pot declaring year zero.
And just sort of the Öcalan hero worshipping of the leader
Absolutely.
type. Yeah. And, to honestly, they are a very different organization as well. The reason I mention the PKK is not to even really talk about it. It's just that, it's interesting that since the 1970s, there has been an evolution within Kurdish politics and within Kurdish society. The PKK has contributed to that, no doubt. And sure, we could talk for a very long time about PKK failings and crimes that they've done in the past. But, what's quite interesting is it's become a revolution, like a snowball rolling down a snowy hill. Is building momentum and it's going bigger. And what we're seeing today in Syria is actually quite special, and it could have wider implications for the Middle East
if it survives. And
if it survives,
and it does.
Hopefully thrives.
So we've talked about your first campaign. What happened after that?
So things started to change certainly over the first year. So I said before how I was blessed to spend a little bit of time on the front line doing nothing almost, or doing training alone. And I was also blessed to fight in and around Tel Hamas, the Abdulaziz Mountain, a little further towards Shadadi. These sort of smaller operations that lasted about a year or so were in villages and towns and on mountain ranges, and they were always at a little bit of a distance. And as the Americans were increasing their support, we were able to call in airstrikes. So we'd go on a campaign and we'd lose, let's say, 10 guys. Things started to change, though, when we crossed the Euphrates, because the tactic early on was always to give ISIS a chance to leave. We would go in a pincer movement. ISIS would always shoot out and choose the easier option. By the time we went to Manbij, which was one of the last places where Turkish supplies were getting to Raqqa, they were utilizing the Turkish border quite effectively for resupply and all the things that they were doing. That's how the 20,000 international fighters even got to the so-called Islamic State. And when they saw the Kurds closing in on Manbij, the ISIS commanders were giving a task not to give up the city, to fight to the last. So at every opportunity that we gave them to leave, they just didn't take it, which meant that it became a battle to the death, quite literally, and hundreds of Kurds died in the streets of Manbij. The worst fighting since Kobani, when it was the other way around, and it was the YPG that were on the back foot. So the fighting I saw there was just relentless, constant night attacks, buildings being brought down by IEDs, American airstrikes, which were much more numerous now, more Americans on the scene. By this point, this was 2016.
Did you run into Americans? Sort of.
I did, yeah, and you'd see them around, mostly calling in airstrikes. They would also have mortar teams as well. That would actually they would fundamentally change after the election of Donald Trump. It was as if the full force of the American military were just given over to the Kurds and to the SDF, because Manbij gave me a hint of what America was providing to the SDF by the amount of airstrikes that were hitting, and just the sight of American soldiers openly walking around and talking to Kurds and stuff. But by the time we went to Raqqa a year later, it was just unbelievable. You couldn't look up into the sky without seeing drones. You could, there were convoys of American troops, thousands of American troops in country, and they were doing remarkable things. I mean, the fighting got a hell of a lot harder, but by the time we got to Raqqa, we had turned a corner, and that the SDF was almost an undefeatable force because of American backing. And finally, ISIS, it was the last stand of the Islamic State.
I mean, that could have come earlier, although, I mean, the crux moment, I guess, was when the vote was called in the House of Commons. Ed Miliband withdrew his previously given support for British military involvement. That, in turn, had an impact on American military support. And so, for a period of time, I guess you didn't have the support that the coalition should have been giving you in order to have the success you needed. What was the cost of Ed Miliband's changing his mind?
Well, time and lives. When I say lives, not just the hundreds of fighters that it took to take positions without artillery and air support, but also just the general barbarity of the Islamic State, which would continue to persecute and massacre the people of Syria and Iraq over that time period. It was probably the greatest reason for me to get involved in the conflict. Just the fact that Britain and America just weren't doing anything at that time. And just my frustration, thinking to myself that every day that goes past, there's a young Yazidi girl trapped in someone's house in Raqqa, being abused by her owner, and then the risk of her being sold on to someone else, or even into a brothel. So the stakes for me were just unbelievably high, and I was compelled as a human being to go and do something. And
when you got to Raqqa, you did in fact come across places where Yazidi women were being held and prostituted and enslaved.
And in Manbij too. There was ISIS would have state brothels, quite literally. And it was just, I never saw any Yazidi girls. And that was actually by far the most devastating aspect of it, particularly in Manbij, where you'd go into a building, there were dirty mattresses on the floor, chains on the floor, but no girls.
The aftermath.
The aftermath. They had already been sprinted away by ISIS long before we got there.
Which must have been incredibly sort of heartbreaking for you, because, you know, it's one of the motivations you had for going there, and to miss them by hours, I guess.
Yeah.
Must have been heartbreaking.
Devastating. And there was even cases before Manbij where they even, I wasn't there, but another unit found the corpses of Yazidi girls which had been executed, because perhaps they didn't have enough space in a vehicle or whatever. So,
there were absolutely thousands of them. I mean, you know, this was not a sort of small number of prisoners of war some of whom had been enslaved and prostituted. I mean, this was an industrial scale rape and pillaging of an entire community, which absolutely constituted genocide in the clearest terms.
Absolutely, and it was the impact on the Yazidi community has been devastating. It's an ancient community in the Middle East, and that's what ISIS is. It's a organization that wishes to erase culture and history, and so that is actually part of the devastating aspect of this war. That Syria is a beautiful country. Palmyra, the Temple of Baal, temples and churches thousands of years old have been eroded, and if you erode a country's history and its cultural heritage, then it starts to become hollowed out. And that's the danger of allowing groups like ISIS to exist in the Middle East, because if you hollow out everything that makes the Middle East good, its diversity, its heritage and everything else, then you've just got a cesspit. You've just got the fertile ground for just the violence to continue, because there's nothing to grab onto. There's no humanity to hold onto anymore. And that's why so many hundreds of thousands are flooding into Europe, because they no longer have faith in their countries anymore. So by the time we got to Raqqa, for me, this was the end. This was their so-called capital. And it was the beating heart of the Islamic State, and we wanted to rip it out.
So tell me about the Battle of Raqqa.
Well, as I said before, the Americans suddenly had invested everything into this battle. We had gone from what I called shark-like attacks, where I would glance up into the sky the year before and I'd see an American plane circling, and I'd watch it as it swooped in and bombed an ISIS position in front of me, and it was truly appreciated. We went from that, where the sharks would circle, to suddenly I had an app on my phone where I could bomb a position if I wanted to. I was in a position of responsibility within my unit, though, so I was able to do that. Not all, obviously, SDF fighters have that capability.
I'm astounded by that, because I mean, I of course, you know, anyone who's seen any war films knows about the business of calling in strikes, but the idea that you might combine that with an app on your phone, is quite remarkable.
It was just incredible. The app was just the rendered picture of Raqqa, an up-to-date photo, literally. And you could zoom in and you could see, even the burnt-out cars, you could see a hole in the streets, even in this picture. So it was only a month old. And there was a little dot in the middle of the screen where wherever the dot went, the coordinates would appear in the corner. So all you'd have to do is put the dot over the house or position that you wanted to hit. And sure enough, you'd call the coordinates in and it would go. And it would also, there was other little things where you could actually see distances and everything else. And you can obviously see Raqqa in its entirety, which again is a great asset for ground forces. So I think the Americans really had got it right. They'd also supplied kitchens for the YPG to feed them properly. They also had more medical facilities to treat fighters. And although it was a terrible battle, again, hundreds of us died, hundreds and hundreds. I lost dozens of friends.
I mean, you personally lost close friends in that.
Yeah, they died in my arms, quite literally. And
it's very difficult to talk about that.
Well, it's almost as if it didn't happen. Like sometimes I glance back to Raqqa and I think to myself, those dark nights, and I think to myself, were they even real? And I'll often be lying in bed, warm in my bed now in London, and I think, and I could almost actually close my eyes and be back in Raqqa and feel what it's like to sleep on that rooftop in Raqqa and the sights and the smells, the constant noise, the daytime, the horrendous flies, and just the daily struggle of living. Because even in Raqqa, it wasn't constant. It really was not. Actually, weeks would go past without any operation. And that was the blessing of Raqqa, was that there were so many of us that 1 minute in the north of the city there would be an operation, then the next minute in the south, and we were just taking bites out of the city. ISIS didn't even know where we were going to hit next. And so a week or two would pass before suddenly I was called up and given 24 hours, a few hours notice that I was going on an operation myself. So it was boredom punctuated by extreme violence there too.
One of the things that I've read in your previous accounts is that you were stuck into mixed units. So your units were not entirely made out of British, Australians and Americans. You had a mixture of people from different countries, including in all units, people who were from Kurdistan.
Absolutely. So actually, the vast majority, it wasn't like the international Toubors of Spain, I'm guessing, or the international units, of Spain. Toubor is a Kurdish word. Because actually in the early days and actually towards the end, the international volunteers were typically put into groups of 5, and then they'll join a group of, let's say, 30 Kurds. So there'll be 5 foreigners, let's say 1 American, 2 Brits, a Frenchman and a German, and they'll be put with a huge Toubor of Kurds. And many of the Kurds came from all around Kurdistan. And they would go on operations. Towards the end, a couple of foreigners were allowed to produce their own all-foreigner Toubors, own all-foreigner units. In fact, I was given the blessing in 2016 to do that when I put together a team of about 10 medics where we had an ambulance and we were going to the front line and treating people. But that was an isolated case. The vast majority of foreigners actually spent their entire time with the Kurdish people.
Tell me about night operations.
So those nights in Raqqa were hellish, very confusing. Obviously my Kurdish wasn't very good. Sometimes the Kurdish way is simply to turn to the foreigner and say, you're going on an operation, because I trust you, because if they didn't trust you, they'd leave you behind. We trust you, come with us, tag along. And it's very informal. They'll have a rough plan. We're going to go down the street. We're going to seize this building, and we're going to see what ISIS do when we take that little building. They'll probably go nuts and come after us, but let's just get there first. And it depended. Sometimes we'd be ambushed on the road. We'd be walking down the street, and then there'll be a burst of gunfire. Someone could get hit, or there'll be an explosion. Someone triggers a mine, and then bang, suddenly you're actually in a different building altogether. So and because I've never been to Raqqa before in my life, and the only way I can even orient myself was because I had this little app and I could see it from the air. Yeah, it was just sometimes you'd get hit, someone would get shot, then we'd go into the next building, we'd call in an airstrike, bang, a huge explosion would go off. We'd use the cover of the smoke and the dust to go to a different building, moving forwards through these different buildings, and actually relying on what other people were doing around us to force ISIS out of a particular area, and utilizing airstrikes too. So it was just incredibly violent. You couldn't go on an operation in Raqqa and not lose someone. That was just how bad it was. And every time I went out, I went knowing that I could possibly die, which was a heavy psychological burden. But at the same time, it almost was that fighting was better than doing nothing, because you felt like a dog on the leash half the time, that you just wanted to go out and fight. And when you be careful what you wish for, because when you go out in Raqqa, it's you get that. You get exactly that, exactly.
So I'd like to talk almost in conclusion before we move on to the final part of this. Tell me about the very final days of the fight for Raqqa and the liberation and the aftermath.
So, as I said before, we were just biting chunks out of Raqqa, just pushing forwards, going through different streets. And ISIS were putting up quite an effective response to us. And actually, and I can't go into detail because it lasted several days, but I was actually blessed to be on the operation that really kind of broke ISIS. Because what effectively happened was we punched forwards and we divided the hospital, which was a major base for ISIS, and the stadium, which was another major base. And we punched right between them, put ourselves smack bang in the middle, and all hell broke loose over a 48-hour period. They even hit us with, and it never happened to me before, actually. It was my first suicide vehicle. They hit us with waves of fighters. And the only reason I think that we even survived was because the Americans blitzed the area. Pretty much everything except for my position, between the hospital and the stadium were hit by airstrikes. And after that, it really broke ISIS, because it became like a hostage situation where the stadium and the hospital were so well reinforced, and there were so many civilians inside them, and so many even prisoners too, that very quickly the YPG was already talking to the Islamic State. And the Islamic State, particularly in the hospital, there was hundreds of injured fighters. They were broken men. They were half-starved. They were desperate. Some wanted to continue and fight to the death. Others were desperate to surrender or even do a deal to get out. So the weeks turned into possibly 1 month, or it was probably just shy of a month, really, that we were just in a hostage situation, shooting at the hospital, trying to hit them. And
they themselves had, as you've said, hostages there. I mean, they were using anybody they could as human shields.
Yeah. There was one time they were dangling babies out the window, and they were determined for us not to attack the hospital. They were utilizing any excuse to say, we've got Yazidis here, we've IED'd all the building up. If you come inside, we'll blow ourselves up. And the Kurds were put in a very difficult position, because had they attacked and killed all of the Islamic State, they would have also killed thousands of Raqqa civilians, the very people who we were supposed to be liberating, and also the thousands of young Yazidi girls who are no doubt in there as well. So and therein lies another problem, that we did a deal with them.
Yeah, and it was a very, very controversial exactly. And difficult choice to have made, really.
But it was, in my view, the right one, because when I saw that, when one day they said to us, it's over. It just came just out of the blue. One day I was doing guard duty. It was 11 a.m. in the morning, and then the radio started blaring, and it was, do not shoot at the Islamic State. 30 minutes later, it was made real by the fact that someone said, look. And we looked at the hospital, and sure enough, ISIS fighters were standing in the windows, where once we would have shot them dead, they were suddenly blasé, and we knew that it was over, and everyone emerged onto the rooftops. And it was a weight off my shoulders, but I also saw ISIS leaving, broken men getting into the buses and leaving. But then I felt a tinge of anger and frustration when I started to read newspaper articles saying that we did a dodgy deal, that we allowed them to go, that we should have crushed them all. Well, you weren't there, armchair warriors. We were there on the front line, and it would have been us attacking the hospital, which was an entrenched position, and it would have been us that had got shot and killed. So it's very easy to throw stones, but I think the right decision was made.
Extraordinary to think that among those leaving were no doubt people who were also from Britain, but who had gone out to fight for IS. I mean, I imagine there were no circumstances in which you met them, but
not of foreigners. I've met plenty of local fighters, but there was one interesting time that I spent in Raqqa, where we were moving forward. Actually, one of the very few day operations that I took part in, and we took a position, and I was shocked to realize it was a jihadi from Australia, and I forget his name now. He's a former doctor, and you could even Google his name and probably find him. He was a doctor who had a white convert, I think, who had gone out to Syria. He's dead now, and I found his home. I slept in his bedroom. I read his diary, and it was just strange to be rooting through his possessions, and no doubt because he was a doctor, he was in the hospital because he survived the Battle of Raqqa. So as you say, a month before the liberation of the city, I would have been in his bedroom reading his diary. And then I was shooting at him, trying to kill him for the time that we were opposite the hospital. But then I would have also seen him leave the hospital when they eventually surrendered. So yeah, it was just sort of strange to know that people of very similar upbringing to me had gone down a very different path and chosen to join the Islamic State. And although I spoke to the authorities in Australia and I gave them whatever information they needed, just in case they caught this guy, he would eventually die, I think, a month or two after the city was liberated.
So you came back to Britain, and when you got here, what reception did you get?
Well, I was questioned by the police, but actually it was broadly very positive by the British public. And most people say, obviously, that they would never do it themselves, but they appreciate anyone who fights against ISIS and actually shows some oomph and actually wanting to help their fellow man. I got a very different reception from some quarters. For instance, I was banned from a couple of universities when I wanted to go and speak, which was a real slap in the face. In fact, the exact words of one person was, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
And who was that?
He was, I forget his name now, but he was certainly one of the very senior people within the University of Central London, UCL, who seemed to think either that
it was Assad Khan, it may have been.
Possibly, yeah, that rings a bell. And I just find it so frustrating that you can't talk openly and honestly about conflicts and criticize ISIS and say how and tell your story quite effectively, which is hopefully quite a unique position and a unique insight into a deadly conflict. But instead you're being curtailed and you're being told that some things aren't worth talking about, or we don't want to offend a certain subgroup, even though it's the Islamic State, and your opinion isn't worth very much. So they're depriving their students of actually hearing a very unique and interesting story.
Your fighting days are over, but your struggle for the Syrian Kurds is not. What are you doing now for them?
So this has always been about supporting the Kurds. It's never been about just going there, fighting, and then leaving. I only went because I knew that I could articulate their experience, that I could actually talk about, through my eyes, what I'd seen, who the YPG were and what they became in the SDF. And that gave me a huge amount of privilege, and it was a privilege that I had to utilize. So when I got back to the UK, I've got a large social media following. I've written articles for all the major newspapers in the UK and even in America too. And I've taken part in documentaries. I've done videos that have gone viral, and I've really tried to plug away at the West, just saying to them, look, we've got something incredibly special in Syria. And we've got the people who are going to defeat ISIS and secure the long-term prosperity of the country and actually bring it out of the darkness and actually hopefully onto the pathway to peace. So it's been challenging, and I consider myself, I suppose, an independent diplomat of the YPG.
Finally, you're a foreign fighter. You returned to Britain. You weren't prosecuted. You weren't put into a de-radicalization program. But then, of course, you weren't fighting for Islamic State. Mm-hmm. What should we be doing with the hundreds of British foreign fighters, half of whom have now returned and many others who survived want to return? What do we do about them, and what do we do about their partners who perhaps haven't participated directly in conflict, but have certainly played some part in the Islamic State and its temporary success?
Well, I spoke in the first episode about what drove me out there. And everyone at home knows what ISIS was in those early days. They saw the images of the girls in the cages. They saw the men being drowned in cages. They saw the Yazidis on the mountain, the Kurds being overrun. They've seen the cultural heritage of the country wiped out and annihilated. The Christians hounded and chased out of the country, if not murdered themselves. And people were upset and angry, and they followed with fascination this conflict. Now, it drove me to go out and fight against the Islamic State. Yet thousands of people from around the world decided to sympathize with ISIS and go out and support them. And these people, really, if I can even call them people, are the worst of the worst. They are ideologically committed to the death cult that is ISIS. They've gone through all kinds of military training. They've been through even more ideological training. And they are as dangerous today as they were when they set off all those years ago. So the idea that they can come back to Europe, come back to America, and actually some of them suffer no consequences whatsoever is utterly horrifying. What does that say about our country, that we would allow our citizens to go abroad, butcher and destroy a country, and then come back and get 3 years in jail? That's a lot to live with. There's young Yazidi girls now who have been abused by ISIS for years, who've lost their parents, who are now in refugee camps, in orphanages, in refugee camps, and they're suffering a life sentence. Yet other young ladies who've joined ISIS are getting 2 years in jail, 3 years in jail, and then being seen as a victim, going through a de-radicalization program and everything else. So what I hope is that these people, that the full force of the law comes down on anyone who's joined ISIS, that we recognize the real victims here, and that those that joined ISIS are a danger to all of us, and that if we are going to move on from this, and if the people of Syria are going to move on too, then we really need to introduce new legislation, get every single ISIS supporter into one, preferably cell or possibly jail, and just pretty much throw away the key as far as I'm concerned.
There is, of course, a flip side to that, which is that at Quilliam, a number of my colleagues have fought in other contexts which are similar, and have now become the greatest and strongest proponents of liberal democracy, and have devoted their lives and efforts, and indeed the knowledge and experience that they've had, to undoing the damage which they did in a previous life.
That's true, and these are remarkable people, and I'm a huge fan of Quilliam and all the people that work there, and I do see that, but I don't suppose any of them committed any massacres or took part in anything that ripped apart communities in the way that ISIS have done. There is this. I do believe in de-radicalization. I do believe people go down the wrong paths, and it's not just obviously radicalization in terms of Islam. It's also on the far right and the far left, and in any parts of life, if you go to the extremes, and if you have violent thoughts, or if you want to force your political point of view or your cultural point of view on anyone else, you are wrong, and that you need to be brought back from the light, preferably as soon as we can intervene. But there is a point of no return, and if you've gone to join the Islamic State after what they've done to the people of Syria, and you've been motivated by what they've done to the Yazidi girls and everything else, then what we owe you as a society becomes less and less. And I do believe in de-radicalization, sure, but punishment has to come first. Put them in jail and de-radicalize them in jail. That's fine by me, and it'll hopefully make them even more sorry by the end. But maybe it's because of what I've experienced over these years, and maybe it's because of how many friends I've lost, but I just can't find it in my heart to ever forgive or ever forget.
Macer Gifford, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Next in Queue podcast, brought to you by Quilliam International, the civil society movement challenging extremism. Please support our work by donating via Patreon at patreon.com/Quilliam International, or by becoming a member of Quilliam Circle at quilliaminternational.com/circle. Tune in next time to see what's next in Queue.